editions looks like in my database. I treat the editions themselves essentially just being titles with years published, and then I have a kind of a synthetic page here by which I can put together the multiple places it's published in, all the different authors who are involved, from dedicatee to editor, publisher, printer, people like that. And then down here, something I'm going to talk more about in a second, this is how I code intertextuality, so forms of citation, anthologization. Let's go through more of this. You can see a little, what is this? No, I don't show you none of this, that's a shame. So this is the raw data form again. You can see these are different ways of being an author. Accursius here is the notes writer, which is a form of commentator or glossator for these books here. Here I count Jacobius Pontius as a contributing author, publisher, and so on. I don't have a drop-down list, but I essentially have about 15 different forms of authorship. Everything from being a translator or a compiler, to being a printer, to being a bookseller, editor. I'm kind of changing subjects, I guess, because the question here is actually the way that texts reproduce each other. So an edition inside or old is something that is reproduced in the text itself. So in this case, this means that the present book anthologizes the concilium in the matter of Brian Zane right here, which is an older text that it anthologizes into the present work. If this present work itself is reproduced or cited or translated or something like that later on, I code it into this category here. So this is where you drop down a particular edition, and this is the reproduction type. So the database is not only pretty rich as far as the sheer number of things that are in it right now, but also the variety of different kinds of information about the relationships between texts, I believe, is really pretty thorough. Now, I know famous last words, but that's my sense of the state of my field and the kind of the relevant questions that I can attack through large amounts of information. Well, data, networks of co-authorship. So this is that same Herman Voltaeus right here. You can see he is the center of a lot of co-authorship with a number of his students. And he directly co-authors with Johannes Calvinus, Denise Godefroy, Jacques Brigat, and so on. This is often just co-authorship in the sense of one person coming along later and being the posthumous editor of another. Sometimes it's translator and editor and so on, but they are forms of textual connection of a very important sort. And basically these larger circles, not coincidentally, coincide with or correlate to the kind of important professors who are training lots of students and themselves writing influential books about Roman and natural law. So intertextuality, I talked about this a moment ago. So ways that texts reproduce each other. Sometimes it's the whole text. Sometimes an earlier, smaller work is bound into the same codex, sometimes translated, anthologized, and so on. So this is a table of the data where, so this is the Lexicon Juridicum. Here's an example. This is one work in French published in 1706. It is a translation of this other work here, the original Latin. This is, I think, Pufendorf's famous book about natural law, originally published in Latin in 1688. So you can see how I connect all these different texts to each other. There you go, intertext, ethnology, quotations, and so on. And these numbers are actually these data are actually very often just identifier numbers themselves. So in raw form, this is really what this looks like instead. Is it possible to lower the lights a little bit? Because I stupidly made this in black, so it's pretty hard to see. Is this one right here?
Yeah, just try some.
Just press all buttons. Okay, so this is a citation network, and let's see, shouldn't be anybody's way if I stand right here. So what I've done right here is map the citations among a set of texts, I think about 15 or 20 texts altogether, that treat a specific question of feudal land tenure. So this is if you put yourself into the intellectual context of the time, this is a very a moving question about whether or not tenants versus landlords are the people we should probably consider to have ownership stakes in pieces of land. And so it's wrapped up in how they understand what feudalism is it one thing, is it many things, how to interpret different documents, and so on. And I'm going to give you the quick version of this. What this shows, this slide and the next slide show is in 50-year segments what the citation networks look like for these different works. Now, sometimes you're going to see just things that look like stars, and don't worry so much about how they're just kind of egocentric network stars like this. The important thing here is the differences in numbers. So here, you have a book from 1270, which cites an earlier book, the text of just stating the code of law from 529. Here you have a work, see this is 1550 to 1600, published in 1570, and what are the things it cites, and so on. And I'll give you the executive summary. Before 1550, and to some extent in the 50 years after 1550, most works cite much older works. So they cite, either cite ancient Roman authors, like you can see Cicero, Ulpian, Julius Aratus, Cicero, and Aristotle right down there. A couple of earlier ones, this is Alcibiades published in the early 16th century and so on. They mostly cite older works from the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, and actually antiquity. And as we move further up in time, again, don't worry about the star shape so much, just look at the numbers involved. Not only do the sheer number of texts grow tremendously, but the actual time lag between the citing text and the cited text drops considerably. So here, in the third of the four quarters that I'm looking at, this is a work from 1610, and you can see the works that it cites come from, mostly from within the last, essentially 50 to 70 years or so of that text. And then this is the first major treatise on this particular subject of land tenure that I found by Tabor, published in 1662, it looks like. And most of the things he cites are from the last 30 to 50 years. So there's a tremendous shrinking of the time horizons of the texts themselves. And ultimately, this is not information. This is information that you could painstakingly sort of check one list against the other and make, lots and lots of little scratch mark lists. That's too bright. Whatever. Anyway, ultimately, you could do this by making lots and lots of small lists. But instead, if you use a technique like this and link as data the information from one text to another, and then let a visualization program like this show you what they all look like in aggregate, you can see these connections and these changes over time in a way that I don't think you could really see otherwise. And this is just something that I did in about an hour, 2 hours of actually sort of playing with the visualizations. If I actually throw, and remember this is only about one kind of land tenure, it's not about all the citations in my database. So at the size of the database as it exists right now, we should be able to see patterns like this on a much larger scale that, they loosely confirm what we think of as how the Enlightenment, there's a publishing boom in the Enlightenment, and there's a sort of a story of the overcoming of scholasticism. However, the kind of the detail and the specific quantities involved are things that, frankly, I don't know, I haven't ever read them elsewhere before, and I don't think they've really been available to scholars before this. I could be wrong, but that's my sense of the contribution of this. This I'm just going to gloss over really quickly. This is publishing networks themselves. I think this is also just a slice of data. I think this is probably Frankfurt. Frankfurt. Smaller towns turn out to be shockingly important. Why should we care about this? So this is a place, Lick, and a publisher in green. So it shows you, publishers and how they're connected to places. Ugh, do we really care about this stuff? Yes, we do, because when you take away what are called appendant nodes, like these are all appendant nodes that just going to go in one direction and not another, if you take away all those, what you can find is transmission chains. You can find that, it's a little bit too hard to read, but you can find that this publisher here publishes in Marburg, and he also publishes down here in Lick. This guy publishes in, this person publishes in Jena and also in Leipzig. And I think it doesn't show you a plurality, so this is probably more than one person as well, if I'm not mistaken. The reason this is important is because how do texts and ideas travel? Well, they don't just travel by, Jean-Jacques Rousseau buys the book of Thomas Hobbes and sits and reads it for a long time and then sort of responds to it. They also travel very concretely in the form of publishing and book distribution networks. And there's a body of current scholarship about this. Kind of goes back to Robert Darnton, but there's current work by people at the University of Leeds. In North Carolina, there's work by a woman named Laura Cruz about Frankfurt publishing and sales in 16th century law. It shows you in particular how publishers and printers and booksellers view the market, where they view demand and interest in certain areas being. And so it's a way of very specifically traveling along roads on a certain day of the week. A book travels from one place to another, quite beyond sort of the abstract sense of the market and the transmission of ideas that we very broadly have. So this is another area in which I hope that a network approach to intertextuality can yield new knowledge about how ideas travel in time. So, to bring you out to the larger context of digital humanities in general, I can't be right. Does this only go 12 more minutes? All right, well, anyway, so research context, basically, I consider this work to be in the area of digital curation and digital inquiry, areas that you've heard of before, corpus curation, data archiving, things like this. So really skipping through this pretty fast. Research agenda, I have a couple of slides to show you where I'm going to go next with this. So this is the technical side, how this project is going to develop. Further populating the database for writing script to crawl through WorldCat and other existing catalogs to massively increase the amount of data that I have. Open access to it, publish the corpus on the web. Use Mallet, which is a semantic mining or topic modeling program. Interoperability of databases is a big interest of mine. I can talk about teaching if there's interest in that as well. I had a chance to talk with some of you about teaching during the day today. Next, historical scholarship is in the area of common pool resources. So loosely speaking, I've been writing about individual rights to property, and next I want to write about collective rights to property. And my inspiration here was Alan Ostrom's work from 20 years ago on governing the commons. So in the interest of time, I won't talk about this too much, but basically there are a few different categories that I summarize as public land, private land, common land, and things that are sort of free. So you can see the basic thematic movement there, individual to collective. And finally, broader digital humanities agenda. So this is very big sort of career level stuff. You know, when I have to imagine today how what I'm doing now in the next few years feeds into a much bigger stream of where I want to go as a scholar and where this area of digital humanities can go. I think that within 10 to 20 years, we will be talking about having digitized and, for that matter, like a structured knowledge about the broader corpus of all texts published, well, ever printed to begin with, and probably going back in manuscript form 1,000 years. We'll have a full corpus scan. We'll find a consensus on the best way to achieve database interoperability. Tens of thousands of people have historical databases probably in North America alone, a lot of them professional historians and other kinds of social scientists. But this information is all siloed, and the question is how to be able to get databases to talk to each other. And this intertextuality, like citations that I've been talking about, it would be a great desideratum to actually have citation discovery software. It works for modern texts right now that follow similar citation formats, but you don't even want to see what citations look like in early modern texts. They're incredibly loose and hard to read. I've also talked to some of you. I have a goal of establishing a conference with scholars who work on computational approaches to networks in European history, much like what I do here. I think the time is right. There's sort of a critical mass of people who do this kind of work. So that would be my goal in the digital humanities. A little rush at the end, but thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.
We have some time for questions.
Going back to the citation network stuff, I was just curious, actually this is a pretty narrow question, but I'll ask it anyhow. I mean, one of the interesting questions here is you said that the citation suddenly became much closer space to the materials, at the source to the target. Can you identify a particular pivot point in the history of citations? Have you drawn, for example, a year-by-year graph of what the lag is between sources and citations or something along those lines?
No, I have not drawn, I haven't done it in that level of granularity yet. Let's see. It's a weird natural experiment because there's a big hiatus in the 30 Years' War. That's the thing. And so there is publishing that goes on during that period, but it's very chaotic because, you know, one area will be hit by war, so they don't publish as many legal texts at that point. So there's really a big jump. I mean, there's a growth in legal publishing in the last 50 years of the 16th century, but then by the time things are being rebuilt, universities reopened after 1648, it was a couple of decades after 48, there's a big jump. I think it's because of that odd sort of caesura in the middle, you can say that the big jump is from 1600 to 1650 or 1648. I have a stronger sense of it than that, I'm afraid. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering how interesting you're finding these networks that are, I guess, growing up in all the different authors in terms of you see branches diverging, anything that could possibly extrapolate is maybe representing different currents of ideas, different genealogies, anything like that. There's just one, I guess, unidirectional shot up into the future.
Mm-hmm. So I can give you one example of that, and it's something that I don't have a demo of here, but an example of that is there's often a political alignment of one institution or another. I mean, on some level, universities are spaces of free thought, and they always, really always have been on one way or the other. But to give you an idea of a university's sort of a physical location where knowledge is created and how it can be politically aligned. In Hesse, there are two major Hessian states, Hesse-Darmstadt and Hesse-Kassel. Their fortunes vary a lot in the 30 Years' War. They fight against each other. Hesse-Kassel is basically paid auxiliary money by France and Sweden, and Hesse Darmstadt is in league with the emperor, even though the emperor is Catholic.